Welcome to Sleepy Owl. Our tale begins not with glory, but with silence. An immense, white silence. Picture a world of endless forests, locked in a perpetual chill, where the sun is a distant, weak memory for half the year. In this harsh and frozen corner of the earth, in the middle of the 15th century, the Slavic peoples lived in scattered, vulnerable principalities. Their reality, for over 200 long years, had been one of submission. To the east, the mighty Golden Horde, successors to the Mongol conquerors, demanded obedience and tribute. Local rulers made the long, humiliating journey to the Khan's court, not to negotiate, but to kneel, to beg for the very right to govern their own lands. This was the natural order, a chain of dominance seemingly forged for eternity. But in the wooden fortifications of the Moscow Kremlin, a new prince came to power in 1462. He inherited a modest domain, one tile in a fractured mosaic. His own grandfather had been a collector of taxes for the Mongol overlords, gathering wealth from his Christian kin to send east. This new ruler, however, carried a different kind of fire within him. Where others saw an unchangeable fate, Ivan III saw a crumbling giant and a fleeting chance. The humiliation of vassalage was not a fact of life to him. It was a smoldering ember in his soul. Yet he knew that rage alone was useless. It needed the cold, patient fuel of strategy. His ambition was not merely independence, but dominance. And he would start not with the masters in the east, but with his rivals at home. His first great target was the powerful northern trading republic of Novgorod. Rich with the wealth of furs and timber, it had long been a world apart. When it sought alliance with the Catholic Kingdom of Lithuania, Ivan seized his holy cause. He declared a crusade to defend the Orthodox faith from betrayal. The ensuing battle was brutal, a clash in the wet marshes that demonstrated Moscow's new, disciplined ways of war. The Republic's militia was shattered. Yet, surrender was not enough for Ivan's vision. When Novgorod's leaders later dared to ask for terms, for some remnant of their ancient freedoms, he returned with overwhelming force. It was to be an ending, not a negotiation. The great bell that had called free citizens to assembly for generations was ripped from its tower and carried to Moscow as a trophy. The charters of liberty were fed to the flames. The leading families were uprooted and exiled, their lands given to men loyal only to the Prince of Moscow. The message echoed across every remaining independent territory: bend or be broken. One by one, through threat, marriage, or force, the scattered Russian lands were drawn into Moscow's tightening orbit. By the 1470s, only one power stood above Ivan, the Golden Horde itself. The moment of truth arrived in 1480, when Khan Ahmed demanded the traditional tribute. The response from Moscow was not gold, but defiance. The Khan's letter was destroyed, his envoys met with violence. It was an unthinkable insult, and it meant war. Two great armies marched to confront each other across the frozen barrier of the Ugra River. They stood there for weeks, through the deepening autumn, a tense stalemate. The Mongols waited for submission. Ivan waited for the ice and snow to cripple their cavalry. No epic charge decided the day. No legendary battle was fought. As the cold bit deeper and supplies ran low, the Mongol army simply turned and began its retreat back to the steppe. The Russian forces watched them go. And just like that, without a final, cathartic clash, the yoke that had weighed upon the neck of the people for 240 years slipped away into the winter mist. It was over. After centuries, they were free. But for a mind like Ivan's, freedom was merely the empty canvas. What would now be painted upon it? With the Mongol shadow lifted, a grander idea took shape. Rome had fallen. Constantinople, the second Rome, had been captured by non-Christian forces. Perhaps, Ivan thought, perhaps Moscow was now destined to be the third Rome, the final and eternal guardian of true Christian faith. His marriage to Sophia Paleologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, was no mere union of man and woman. It was a symbolic wedding of Moscow to the legacy of fallen empire. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium became the symbol of the Russian state. To bind this emerging realm together, Ivan crafted a new system, the service state. Unlike the feudal West, where nobles owned land as a right, here all land was a grant from the sovereign, held only in trust. That trust depended on one thing: loyal service to the crown. Land could be taken away as easily as it was given. Rebellion was now not just treason, it was economic suicide. When Ivan died in 1505, he left his son Vasily a kingdom united from the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains. The foundation of an empire was laid, stone by patient, cunning stone. But what shape would the building take? And who would be strong enough or terrible enough to raise its walls higher? The work of consolidation fell to Vasily III, a ruler who mirrored his father's methodical nature. His reign was one of careful absorption, like a slow-moving glacier grinding down the last remaining peaks of independence. He understood that true power meant looking not only east to the receding steppes, but west to the kingdoms of Europe. The recapture of the strategic city of Smolensk from Lithuania was a clear signal. Moscow was no longer just defending itself from nomadic raiders. It was now projecting its strength against established Christian kingdoms. The fledgling state was learning to flex its muscles. Yet, the system was still fragile, its stability dependent on the will of a single, capable ruler. When Vasily died in 1533, that weakness was violently exposed. His heir, Ivan IV, was just 3 years old. The realm plunged into a regency governed not by law, but by the vicious, unchecked ambitions of the noble boyar families. For years, the corridors of the Kremlin became a battleground of conspiracies and murders. The young prince, ignored and often endangered, watched from the shadows as powerful men tore at the fabric of his state. These formative years of chaos and humiliation would sear themselves into the boy's psyche, forging a ruler of unparalleled complexity and profound darkness. When he finally came of age and was crowned in 1547, he did not take the title of Grand Prince. He chose a name that thundered with historical ambition, Tsar. Derived from Caesar, it was a direct claim to the legacy of the Roman and Byzantine emperors. The frightened boy who had cowered in his chambers was gone. In his place stood a young sovereign determined that the humiliations of his childhood would never, ever be repeated. And for a time, hope blossomed. Surrounded by a capable, chosen council, Tsar Ivan IV launched sweeping reforms. He created Russia's first professional standing army, armed with modern firearms. He introduced new legal codes to bring order to a patchwork of local customs. He streamlined the chaotic administration. This early, rational energy then turned outward with spectacular success. The Tatar Khanate of Kazan, a persistent remnant of Mongol power that had terrorized Russian lands for centuries, became his target. In 1552, after a brutal siege employing the latest European artillery, its walls fell. The conquest was more than a military victory. It was a profound psychological reversal. 4 years later, the Khanate of Astrakhan followed. Suddenly, the entire mighty Volga River, from its heartland to the Caspian Sea, was under Moscow's control. Orthodox churches now rose where minarets had stood. The balance of power in the east had irrevocably shifted. Where once Russian princes trembled at Tatar war cries, they now dictated terms. But success, as it so often does, planted the seeds of downfall. Flush with these eastern triumphs, Ivan's gaze turned westward, to the Baltic coast. He sought a window to Europe, a direct trade route unobstructed by rivals. What began as a strategic campaign against the weakened Livonian order spiraled into a 25-year quagmire. Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark all intervened, transforming a local war into a grueling struggle against multiple, technologically superior enemies. As the years dragged on, as defeats mounted and costs soared, the Tsar's mind began to curdle. The reasonable reformer was being consumed by suspicion. The ultimate betrayal came in 1564, when one of his most brilliant and trusted commanders, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, defected to the enemy, even writing letters to condemn Ivan's growing tyranny. This act shattered the Tsar's remaining trust. In response, he made a fateful, terrifying decision. He would divide his own kingdom. He created the Oprichnina, a separate personal domain ruled not by law, but by his own will, enforced by a brotherhood of black-clad, dog-head-emblemed riders utterly loyal to him alone. It was a declaration of war on his own state, on the very nobility his ancestors had bound to the crown. The Oprichniki were unleashed as an instrument of pure terror. Ancient boyar families, the pillars of the realm, were accused of conspiracy on the flimsiest of whispers. Their lands were seized, their members executed or exiled to frozen wastelands. The city of Novgorod, which Ivan's grandfather had so carefully integrated, was singled out for a special horror. Convinced it was plotting to defect, Ivan led his Black Knights on a 5-week carnival of atrocity. Thousands were tortured and executed, their bodies cast into the icy river. Libraries containing centuries of history were put to the torch. The once great republic was left broken, a hollow shell. This internal reign of terror achieved the opposite of its intent. It did not strengthen Russia for its foreign wars. It gutted the very regions that supplied its soldiers and grain. The state, meticulously built over a century, was being cannibalized by its own creator. And the outside world was watching. In 1571, the Crimean Tatars, seeing the chaos, launched a devastating raid. They swept right up to Moscow itself, burning much of the capital and carrying off tens of thousands into slavery. The Tsar's prestige lay in ashes alongside the city's buildings. Ivan the Terrible, a title meaning the awesome or the fearsome, had become a self-destructive monster. He died in 1584, leaving the throne to his feeble-minded son, Fifer. The dynasty's future hung by a thread. What would happen when that thread, stretched so thin by terror, finally snapped? The thread did not take long to snap. With the death of the childless Fifer in 1598, the ancient Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled in some form for over 7 centuries, flickered out. A competent boyar, Boris Godunov, seized the throne. He was intelligent and skilled, but he lacked the mystical, blood-borne legitimacy that the people craved. When catastrophic famine struck in the early 1600s, killing perhaps a third of the population, many saw it as divine punishment for this usurpation. In this cauldron of suffering and superstition, a phantom appeared. He called himself Dmitri, claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, who had supposedly survived an assassination attempt. Was he a true believer in his own story, or a brilliant adventurer? It mattered little. To a desperate, starving people, he was a symbol of hope and a return to sacred order. With Polish backing, his forces swept away Godunov's army, and the false Dmitri was crowned Tsar. His reign lasted less than a year before he, too, was overthrown in a boyar conspiracy. But the dam had broken. What followed was the time of troubles, a dizzying cascade of pretenders, foreign invasions, and social collapse. Polish armies occupied Moscow. Swedish forces seized the northwest. Cossack bands and local warlords ravaged the countryside, carving out their own petty kingdoms. The unified state, so painstakingly assembled, seemed destined to shatter into 100 fragments, lost to history. Yet, in the very depths of this abyss, a new force emerged. It was not a prince or a general, but an idea, holy resistance. The Trinity Sergius Monastery, besieged by Polish troops for 16 long months, became a beacon of defiance. From this spiritual fortitude, a national uprising was born, transcending local loyalties. A liberation army, formed by the nobleman Prince Pozharsky and the merchant Minin, finally drove the Poles from the Kremlin in 1612. From the ashes, a new question arose. Who could rule? In 1613, a grand assembly of the land convened. After much deliberation, they chose a solution based on legitimacy over strength. 16-year-old Michael Romanov, whose only qualification was a distant familial link to the old dynasty through marriage. It was a choice for stability, a desperate grasp for normalcy. The Romanov era had begun. The task before them was monumental. The realm was depopulated, its treasury empty, its authority a hollow concept. Yet, from this near-total ruin, the patient work of reconstruction began. Under Michael and his formidable father, Patriarch Filaret, the administrative machinery was rebuilt. The new dynasty systematically addressed the weaknesses the time of troubles had exposed. They created new military regiments trained in European fashion, staffed by foreign officers. The economy was slowly nursed back to life through state monopolies and trade incentives. By the time Michael's son, Alexis, took the throne in 1645, Russia had largely healed its wounds. And with health came renewed ambition. Where his father had sought to restore, Alexis looked to expand. A monumental opportunity arrived from the south. The Cossacks of Ukraine, Orthodox warriors chafing under Polish Catholic rule, rebelled under the leadership of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. In 1654, they offered their allegiance to the Tsar in Moscow in exchange for protection. Alexis accepted, knowing full well it meant a permanent, titanic war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This decision was a turning point. Russia was no longer just recovering, it was now an expansionist empire. The war that followed was long and complex, drawing in Sweden and revealing Russia's still awkward place in European diplomacy. The 1667 Treaty of Andrusovo brought substantial gains. Kiev and all Ukrainian lands east of the Dnieper River now belonged to the Tsar. Millions of Orthodox believers were under Moscow's protection for the first time since the Mongol conquest. But the acquisition came with a lasting problem. The Cossacks, fiercely independent, proved just as resistant to Moscow's autocratic control as they had been to Poland's. This tension would simmer for centuries. At home, another kind of schism was tearing at the nation's soul. Patriarch Nikon's reforms to religious texts and rituals, meant to align Russian orthodoxy with Greek practices, split the church violently. Those who rejected the changes, the old believers, were persecuted with stunning brutality. The state, it seemed, demanded uniformity not only in politics but in the very way people prayed. When Alexis died in 1676, another succession crisis loomed. His sickly son Feofor III ruled briefly, then died childless. The throne was disputed between two half-brothers, the infirm Ivan V and the vigorous, precocious Peter, both still boys. Power fell to their elder sister, Sophia, who ruled as regent. Sophia's regency from 1682 to 1689 was the last attempt to govern Russia by the old Muscovite principles, cautious, traditional, and inward-looking. She was capable, but her reign was marked by unsuccessful military campaigns that highlighted the system's limitations. All the while, her younger brother Peter was growing up, and his world was not the secluded Kremlin chambers. His playground was the German quarter of Moscow, where Western engineers, soldiers, and merchants lived. There, he developed not just a fascination, but an obsession with European technology, science, and military methods. The clash between the old world and the new was inevitable. In August 1689, Peter, now 17, launched a coup, ending his sister's regency and seizing power for himself. The quiet, incremental era was over. A storm was coming. A storm that would not just change Russia, but reshape the map of the entire continent. What happens when a force of nature is given an imperial crown? Peter the Great did not merely inherit a throne, he seized it as a tool for transformation. He was a whirlwind of restless energy and insatiable curiosity, a giant of a man whose vision was as vast as the lands he ruled. He looked at his realm and saw not a sacred Orthodox kingdom, but a backward, isolated place, lagging centuries behind the powers of Europe. His mission, self-appointed and all-consuming, was to drag it into the modern age, no matter the cost. His first lessons in power were brutal. A revolt by the traditional palace guards, the Streltsy, erupted while he was abroad on his unprecedented Grand Embassy. Upon his return, his response was merciless. The old military elite was systematically destroyed through mass executions, its units disbanded, their families scattered. Peter himself is said to have wielded an axe. The message was unmistakable. The Muscovite past was dead, and he would personally bury it. He then turned his fury and focus outward, toward the Baltic Sea and the dominant power there, Sweden. The Great Northern War, begun in 1700, would consume 2 decades of his life and define his legacy. It started in disaster. At the Battle of Narva, his new model army, still raw and unprepared, was annihilated by the brilliant young Swedish king, Charles XII. European diplomats wrote Russia off as a barbarian state, hopelessly outmatched. Yet, this crushing defeat became Peter's greatest teacher. He abandoned half measures and built an entirely new military machine from the ground up. Universal conscription created a massive standing army. Hundreds of foreign officers were hired to train it. He founded schools for artillery and engineering. To supply this new force, he forced an industrial revolution, building vast ironworks in the Urals that churned out cannon and muskets at an unprecedented rate. This was not reform. It was a reinvention of the state itself for the sole purpose of war. Administratively, he swept away the ancient, haphazard institutions. The advisory Boyar Council was abolished, replaced by a professional Senate. A table of ranks was created, making state service the path to nobility, not just birth. Talent, in theory, could now rise from anywhere. And to symbolize his complete break with the past, he founded a new capital from nothing. On marshy, disease-ridden islands at the mouth of the Neva River, where thousands of conscripted laborers perished, he built St. Petersburg, a window to Europe carved by sheer will and human suffering. It was a European city in style, layout, and spirit, a defiant statement facing westward. The war's turning point came at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. Charles XII, having invaded Ukraine, marched his legendary army into a trap. Peter's reformed forces, now disciplined and well-equipped, crushed the Swedes utterly. The victory resounded across Europe like a thunderclap. The balance of power had shifted. Subsequent campaigns saw Russian troops occupy Finland and the Baltic coast. The 1721 Treaty of Nystad confirmed Sweden's defeat, granting Russia its window and secure ports. That same year, Peter discarded the title of Tsar. He proclaimed himself emperor. Russia was now an empire, recognized as a major European power. The transformation within society was equally profound and equally wrenching. The nobility was forced to shave their beards and wear European clothes. Their children were compelled to study mathematics and navigation. The Orthodox Church, a potential source of opposition, was neutered. The Patriarchate was abolished and replaced by a state-controlled, Holy Synod, making the Church a department of the government. Yet, the human cost of this breakneck modernization was staggering. Peasant rebellions erupted under the weight of new taxes and forced labor. His own son and heir, Alexei, suspected of opposing the reforms, was tortured and died in prison. Even Peter's military genius had limits, as a failed campaign against the Ottoman Empire on the Pruth River demonstrated. When Peter died in 1725, he left an empire transformed beyond recognition, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. But he also left a system dangerously dependent on his own titanic will. He had failed to establish a clear line of succession. The question now hung heavy in the air of his magnificent, artificial capital. Could the machine he built run without its furious, relentless engineer? Or would it shudder to a halt, consumed by the very tensions he had ignited? The machine did not stop, but it lurched and shuddered violently. Peter's death plunged the empire into a decades-long succession crisis, a hidden war not for borders, but for the empire's very soul. His widow, Catherine I, and his young grandson, Peter II, reigned briefly as puppets for the old aristocracy, who desperately tried to reverse the reforms, even moving the court back to Moscow. But the past could not be so easily resurrected. The aristocracy's overreach came in 1730. They offered the throne to Anna, a niece of Peter the Great, on the condition she sign away her autocratic powers, creating a constitutional monarchy ruled by a council of nobles. For 37 days, it seemed Russia might follow a different path. But Anna, once crowned, theatrically ripped up the documents and declared herself absolute sovereign. Her reign, dominated by her German favorite Ernst Byron, became known for political repression, the German Terror. Yet, beneath this surface of reaction, Peter's fundamental state structure remained intact. It had proven more durable than anyone imagined. The true return to Peter's spirit arrived with his daughter, Elizabeth, who seized power in a palace coup in 1741. For 20 years, she crafted a synthesis, embracing European culture and military science while celebrating a distinctly Russian Orthodox and Slavic identity. Under her, the empire flourished culturally and militarily. The founding of Moscow University in 1755 planted a seed of learning. And during the continent-wide 7 Years' War, Russian armies proved their might by humiliating Europe's finest commander, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and even occupying Berlin in 1760. Russia was now a decisive arbiter of European power. Elizabeth chose her nephew, Peter III, as heir, marrying him to a minor German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, the future Catherine. It was a choice meant to secure stability. It produced chaos. Peter III, who admired Prussia more than Russia, reigned for just 6 months in 1762. His decisions, especially making a sudden, separate peace with Prussia, outraged the military and the elite. He was seen as a traitor to national interests. His wife, however, had spent 18 years meticulously preparing. She learned Russian, converted to Orthodoxy, and cultivated powerful allies. In a bloodless coup, she deposed her husband, who was murdered days later. Catherine, too, soon to be called the Great, ascended the throne, not by birthright, but by determination and political brilliance. Catherine understood that her seized power required a new kind of legitimacy. She would rule not just by force, but by the power of ideas. An avid correspondent with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, she styled herself an enlightened monarch. She convened a grand legislative commission to draft new laws, instructing them with a visionary nakaz, or instruction, filled with progressive principles on justice and governance drawn from European thinkers. It was largely symbolic, but it announced her ambition to modernize the mind of the state. Reality, however, had a way of confronting philosophy. In 1773, a massive rebellion erupted in the Volga region, led by the Cossack Emelian Pugachev, who claimed to be the murdered Peter III. Promising an end to serfdom and noble tyranny, he rallied hundreds of thousands of the dispossessed. The revolt was a thunderous verdict on the gap between Catherine's enlightened words and the brutal facts of Russian life. It was crushed with horrific severity, Pugachev executed in Moscow's Red Square. The experience deeply changed Catherine. Reform would proceed, but cautiously, and never at the expense of the noble class that was her power base. Her true genius, and her lasting legacy, was found in expansion. In 2 brilliant wars against the decaying Ottoman Empire, she achieved what had been a dream for centuries. The Treaty of Kuchakhenarji in 1774 gave Russia unprecedented rights in the Black Sea and made the Crimean Khanate independent, a prelude to full annexation in 1783. For the first time, Russia had a warm-water navy based at the newly built fortress of Sevastopol. She even conceived of a Greek project, a fantastical plan to conquer Constantinople and restore a Christian Byzantine empire under Russian protection. In the West, she presided over the eradication of Russia's ancient rival. In 3 partitions between 1772 and 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria wiped Poland entirely off the map. Catherine's share brought millions of new subjects in Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine under imperial rule. She governed this staggering diversity with a policy of pragmatic integration, often preserving local institutions while ensuring ultimate control from St. Petersburg. By her death in 1796, Catherine had added more territory to the empire than any ruler since Ivan the Great a century before. She had turned the Russian court into a dazzling center of European art and learning, founding the Hermitage Museum. Yet, the fundamental contradiction of her reign remained, festering and unresolved. The enlightened philosophe who wrote about liberty and law also presided over the greatest expansion of serfdom in Russian history, binding millions more souls to the land. She left an empire of majestic scale and glittering sophistication, built upon a foundation of profound human bondage. The next ruler would inherit not just this colossal edifice, but the deep, seismic fault lines running through its very core. Could the structure hold if the ground beneath it began to shake? The ground shook immediately. Catherine's son, Paul I, had spent 42 years in the shadow of his brilliant, domineering mother, nursing grievances that curdled into obsession. His reign was a reaction against everything she represented. He reversed her policies, exiled her favorites, and imposed a rigid, Prussian-style militarism on the court and army. His foreign policy lurched from alliance to enmity, culminating in a sudden admiration for Napoleon Bonaparte. The governing class, bewildered and alienated, saw not a sovereign, but a capricious tyrant undermining the state's stability. In March 1801, a group of high officials and guards officers staged a palace coup. Paul was murdered in his bedroom. His son and heir, Alexander, knew of the plot. He would inherit a throne stained with his father's blood, a terrible secret that would haunt his soul and his reign. Alexander I was a puzzle, a man torn between conflicting ideals. His liberal tutors had filled him with Enlightenment dreams of constitutional rule and human liberty. Yet, he was now the absolute autocrat of an empire built on serfdom and unquestioning obedience. This inner conflict defined his 24-year rule. He began with reformist whispers, empowering the brilliant bureaucrat Mikhail Speransky to draft plans for a constitution and a modern legal code. But each step forward met fierce resistance from the nobility, and Alexander's own resolve would waver, leaving grand plans to gather dust. His attention was soon seized by an external storm that dwarfed all domestic concerns. Napoleon Bonaparte's armies had subjugated continental Europe. Alexander found himself cast, almost by default, as the last great obstacle to French hegemony. The two emperors met on a raft in the Niemen River at Tilsit in 1807, forming an uneasy, distrustful alliance. But their ambitions were incompatible. Napoleon's continental system, which banned trade with Britain, crippled the Russian economy. The break was inevitable. In June 1812, Napoleon launched his fatal gamble, the invasion of Russia. His Grande Army, over 600,000 strong, crossed the Niemen. The Russian response was not a heroic stand, but a calculated, devastating retreat. They drew the invaders deep into the vast interior, stretching French supply lines to breaking point. They employed a scorched earth policy, burning their own towns and fields to deny the enemy food and shelter. It was a strategy of sacrifice, turning the land itself into a weapon. The single great battle came at Borodino, a brutal, bloody stalemate fought within sight of Moscow's domes. Though the French held the field, their losses were catastrophic. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, only to find it abandoned and soon ablaze, set on fire by retreating Russians or perhaps by accident. Master of a city of ashes, with winter approaching and his army starving, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. The journey back became one of history's most horrific catastrophes. Harassed by Cossacks, partisans, and the merciless cold, the Grande Army disintegrated. Fewer than 30,000 ragged men recrossed the Niemen. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility had frozen to death in the Russian snow. Alexander emerged as the liberator of Europe, leading his armies all the way to Paris. Russia's prestige soared to unimaginable heights. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the emperor was at the pinnacle of worldly power. Yet, the victory created its own burdens. Russia now possessed a constitutional kingdom within its borders, Congress Poland, and had annexed Finland, territories with traditions of law and self-rule that sat uneasily within the autocratic system. Furthermore, the experience of Europe had exposed his own officers to ideas of liberty and nationhood. They had liberated foreign peoples. Why? Some began to ask, should their own remain in chains? In his later years, the enlightened reformer vanished, replaced by a man consumed by religious mysticism, speaking of divine purpose while abandoning practical governance. When Alexander died suddenly in the southern city of Taganrog in 1825, confusion over the succession, between his brother Constantine and his younger brother Nicholas, created a brief power vacuum. It was the moment a small group of idealistic, noble officers had been waiting for. On a freezing December morning, they marched their regiments to St. Petersburg's Senate Square, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas. They demanded a constitution, the rule of law, and an end to serfdom. This was the Decembrist Revolt, the first organized, secular challenge to autocracy from within Russia's own elite. It was poorly coordinated and quickly crushed by loyal artillery. But its significance was profound. The genie of revolutionary thought was out of the bottle. 5 leaders were hanged, hundreds were exiled to Siberia. The new Tsar, Nicholas I, surveyed the square cleared by cannon smoke and drew a singular, iron conclusion. Order must be preserved at any cost. And so, an era of ice began. What happens when an empire chooses to stand perfectly, fearfully still, in a world that is beginning to move faster than ever before? Nicholas I ruled for 30 years with the unshakable conviction of a fortress commander under siege. The Decembrist revolt had revealed the enemy within: progressive ideas. His life's mission became the eradication of that enemy and the preservation of the autocratic system, unchanged and unchallenged. He created the Third Section, a secret police force with sweeping powers to monitor, censor, and suppress any whisper of dissent. Censorship descended like a thick fog, smothering not just political speech, but literature, philosophy, even music. Universities were placed under strict surveillance. Foreign travel for students was restricted. The state's new official ideology, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, was less a vision for the future than a defiant wall against the outside world. Yet, while Nicholas sought to freeze politics, the ground was shifting beneath his feet. The world was industrializing. Despite the state's suspicion, railways began to stitch the vast empire together, accelerating the flow of ideas as well as goods. In the regions around Moscow and St. Petersburg, factories rose, creating a new class, the industrial proletariat, crowded into miserable conditions and ripe for collective anger. Even the ancient institution of serfdom was showing economic cracks, becoming less profitable for landowners and more burdensome for the state. Remarkably, in this climate of intellectual suffocation, a golden age of Russian culture flourished. Writers like Alexander Pushkin, Mikhail Lermontov, and Nikolai Gogol created a literature of astonishing depth and power. While avoiding direct political confrontation, their works explored themes of individual dignity, social injustice, and spiritual yearning that posed quiet, profound questions about the society Nicholas was trying to cement. Meanwhile, intellectual salons buzzed with the great debate between Zapadnik, who believed Russia must follow Europe's path of development, and Slavophiles, who argued for a unique, communal Slavic destiny. Both positions, in their own way, were critiques of the stagnant present. Nicholas's foreign policy was an extension of his domestic fortress mentality. He styled himself the gendarme of Europe, using Russian armies to crush liberal revolutions abroad, most notably in Hungary in 1849. But his deepest fixation was the decaying Ottoman Empire, the Eastern question. He saw himself as the protector of millions of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule and coveted control of the strategic Turkish Straits. This religious and strategic ambition put him on a collision course with Britain and France, who feared Russian dominance of the Mediterranean. This collision came in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. It began with a squabble over Orthodox access to holy sites in Jerusalem, but swiftly escalated. Nicholas, believing in conservative solidarity with Austria and Prussia and underestimating Anglo-French resolve, marched into Ottoman territories. He was disastrously wrong. Britain and France allied with the Ottomans. The war became a brutal siege of Russia's Great Black Sea naval base, Sevastopol. For 11 months, Russian soldiers displayed legendary courage, defending the fortress against a technologically superior enemy. But courage could not compensate for the empire's backwardness. The Allies had steam-powered warships, rifled muskets, and advanced logistics. Russian troops often faced them with smoothbore muskets and sailing ships. The supply lines were a catastrophe. Men died more frequently from disease and malnutrition than enemy fire. The war exposed, for all the world to see, that the Nicholas system had produced not strength, but profound, dangerous weakness. Nicholas did not live to see the final defeat. He died in 1855, as Sevastopol was falling. His son, Alexander II, inherited a shattered illusion and a nation in trauma. The empire had been humiliated on its own soil by European powers. The myth of Russian military invincibility, born of 1812, was dead. The treasury was bankrupt. But from this crushing defeat came a terrible, clarifying light. Every assumption was now open to question. The system had failed. It was no longer a matter of whether to change, but how fast and how far. Could the new Tsar reform an ancient, rigid structure fast enough to save it? Or would the very act of opening the door unleash forces he could never hope to control? Alexander II began his reign with a clarity born of catastrophe. The Crimean defeat was not just a lost war, it was an autopsy revealing a diseased state. The courage of the serf soldiers who died at Sevastopol for a system that enslaved them created an unbearable moral and practical contradiction. To survive, Russia had to modernize. And modernization, the new Tsar understood, began with the most fundamental institution of all, human bondage. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 was the single greatest social reform in Russian history. With one manifesto, over 23 million human beings were granted personal freedom. They could own property, marry without permission, and seek their own livelihoods. The legal right of one person to buy and sell another vanished. It was a monumental act of conscience and political will. But the Tsar Liberator soon learned that liberation is never simple. The settlement was a complex compromise that pleased almost no one. The freed peasants received land allotments, but these were often smaller and poorer than the plots they had worked as serfs. To pay for this land, they were burdened with redemption payments to the state, stretching for 49 years. They remained tied to their village communes, which held collective responsibility for taxes. For many peasants, this felt not like freedom, but a new kind of debt servitude. Rebellions erupted in the countryside, met with military force. The great act of liberation thus sowed seeds of bitter disappointment that would grow for generations. Emancipation necessitated a cascade of other reforms, known as the Great Reforms. A new judicial system was created, modeled on European principles: public trials, independent judges, trial by jury. For the first time, a Russian peasant could stand in court as the legal equal of a noble. Zemstvos, elected local assemblies, were established to manage schools, roads, and healthcare, providing a fragile seedling of self-government. Military service was reformed, universities were granted new autonomy, and censorship was relaxed. For a time, a new energy seemed to pulse through the empire. Yet Alexander's reforms created a dangerous paradox. By loosening the strictures of autocracy, he raised expectations he could not fulfill. The educated public, now able to read and debate more freely, wanted more: a constitution, a national parliament. Radical intellectuals, despairing of peaceful change, turned to violence. A revolutionary underground took root, with groups like Land and Liberty plotting the regime's overthrow. The state's response alternated between reform and repression, confusing both allies and enemies. When Poland rose in rebellion in 1863, demanding independence, Alexander crushed it with great severity, rolling back Polish autonomy and launching a program of forced Russification. This harshness alienated liberals at home and abroad. As revolutionary terror grew, including several attempts on the Tsar's own life, the reformist impulse within the government withered. Conservatives gained influence, arguing that every concession only bred more danger. Alexander's personal life grew troubled, and the state's finances grew strained by foreign adventures, including a successful but costly war against the Ottoman Empire in 1877–78. By 1881, the Tsar Liberator was a weary, hesitant ruler, caught between the revolutionaries who wanted to destroy him and the reactionaries who believed he had already destroyed the state. His advisors proposed a final, cautious step: a plan to create a modest consultative assembly, a bridge to a more representative form of government. It was a last chance for evolutionary change. He never signed it. On March 1, 1881, in St. Petersburg, a bomb thrown by a member of the revolutionary group People's Will tore into Alexander's carriage. As he stepped out, dazed and bleeding, a second assassin threw another bomb directly at his feet. The Tsar who had freed millions was killed by the very forces of change his own actions had unleashed. His blood on the snow marked the end of an era of reform. The next ruler surveying this scene would draw a very different lesson. The question of Russia's future would now be answered not by liberation, but by a clenched fist. Could the empire be frozen in time once more, or had the thaw already gone too far? Alexander III was the embodiment of the clenched fist. His father's mutilated body taught him one lesson: reform was suicide. His reign became a systematic, uncompromising counter-revolution. Giant in stature and unyielding in will, he sought to roll back the clock, to reforge the autocracy in its most absolute, patriarchal form. The proposed constitution was shredded. The powers of the Zemstvo assemblies were slashed. Universities were placed under strict police control. The press was muzzled. The independent judiciary was undermined. The watchwords were order, authority, and Russification. This last policy struck at the empire's diverse heart with a new ruthlessness. In Poland, the Baltic provinces, and Finland, local languages and institutions were suppressed in a campaign of forced cultural assimilation. For the empire's large Jewish population, these years brought the nightmare of state-sanctioned pogroms, violent, murderous riots that drove millions toward emigration or revolutionary despair. The state was declaring itself not just a political entity, but a monolithic Russian Orthodox nation, intolerant of any difference. Yet, while Alexander III tried to freeze politics, the economy defied him. Under the brilliant finance minister Sergei Witte, the empire plunged headlong into industrialization. Foreign capital flooded in to build railways, most spectacularly the Trans-Siberian, a steel spine stretching to the Pacific. Factories mushroomed around Moscow, in Ukraine's coal fields, and in the oil-rich Caucasus. This economic transformation, however, created the very social forces autocracy feared most: a concentrated, miserable industrial working class in the cities, and a growing class of professionals, lawyers, engineers, doctors, who demanded a voice in political life. Revolutionary movements adapted to this new landscape. Marxist ideas, preaching the inevitable conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, found fertile soil in the grim factory districts. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was founded in 1898. In its ranks, a young, fiercely determined revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin began his rise. Another group, the Socialist Revolutionaries, combined Marxist theory with the peasant-focused terror of the past, assassinating dozens of high officials. Alexander III's sudden death from illness in 1894 brought his son, Nicholas II, to the throne. Where the father was granite, the son was wax. Nicholas was a man of personal kindness and deep domestic piety, but he possessed a fatal combination: a mystical belief in his own God-appointed autocratic power, and a complete lack of the strength, vision, or political skill needed to wield it. "I shall maintain the principle of autocracy," he declared at the outset, "as firmly and unflinchingly as my late father." It was a promise that would doom his dynasty. His reign began with an omen of disconnect. During celebrations for his coronation in 1896, a stampede on Kodinka field killed over 1,000 people. Nicholas, poorly advised, attended a ball that same evening, appearing callously indifferent to the tragedy. This distance between the remote, divinely anointed Tsar and his suffering people would only grow. His marriage to Alexandra, a German princess, brought him personal solace but political catastrophe. Shy, intensely religious, and fiercely protective of her family, she would become a vessel for the most destructive influences on the throne. As Nicholas proved weak and vacillating, her influence grew, and with it, her desperation to preserve autocratic power for their only son, Alexei, who suffered from the bleeding disease hemophilia. This desperation led them to a Siberian mystic, Grigory Rasputin. His apparent ability to soothe the boy's suffering gave him unparalleled influence over the empress, and through her, over state appointments and policy. Rasputin's dissolute lifestyle and blatant political meddling became a scandal that discredited the entire ruling family in the eyes of nobles, soldiers, and commoners alike. The sacred aura of the monarchy was dissolving into tales of corruption and superstition. Seeking a distraction from domestic failures and a boost to national pride, the regime embarked on expansion in the Far East, clashing with the rising power of Japan. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, was meant to be a small, victorious war. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian fleet at Tsushima. On land, the empire's military incompetence and logistical failures were laid bare. The defeat was not just strategic, it was a psychological earthquake. An Asian power had humiliated a European empire. The autocracy's claim to divine protection and competent leadership lay in ruins. The shockwaves reached home immediately. In January 1905, a peaceful march of workers and their families, led by a priest, Father Gapon, approached the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Little Father, Tsar. They were met with volleys of rifle fire. Bloody Sunday shattered the ancient, mystical bond between ruler and people forever. The year 1905 exploded in revolution, nationwide strikes, peasant uprisings, mutinies in the army and navy. The empire teetered on the brink of collapse. In October, facing total ruin, Nicholas reluctantly issued a manifesto, promising civil liberties and the creation of an elected parliament, the Duma. It was a concession wrung from him by force. The absolute autocrat had been forced to share power. But did he truly mean to share it? Or was he merely waiting for a chance to take it all back? The October Manifesto of 1905 created a fragile, shimmering mirage, a constitutional Russia. Political parties formed, newspapers bloomed, and the first Duma, a national parliament, was elected. But it was a mirage built on sand. Nicholas II had granted these liberties under duress, not from conviction. In his heart, he still believed autocracy was a sacred trust. The fundamental laws he issued in 1906 made this clear. The Tsar remained the supreme autocratic power, and ministers answered to him, not to the Duma. The parliament could debate, but it could not truly govern. The first two Dumas, dominated by liberals and socialists demanding radical land reform and real political power, were swiftly dissolved by the Tsar. The electoral law was then illegally rewritten to ensure a conservative, pliable majority. The constitutional experiment was revealed as a facade. Real power now rested with the Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, a man of iron will who believed in a simple formula: first pacification, then reform. His pacification was brutal. Military field courts handed down thousands of death sentences for revolutionaries and rebels. The hangman's noose became known as Stolypin's necktie. But his reform was visionary. His agrarian policy aimed to create a bedrock of stability by destroying the peasant commune and creating a new class of independent, prosperous small landowners. A wager on the sober and the strong, he called it. He believed these new farmers would become natural conservatives, loyal supporters of the throne. For a few years, it seemed his gamble might work. The revolutionary tide receded. The economy boomed, fueled by foreign investment and rising agricultural production. But the underlying sickness remained. The court, isolated in its world of mysticism and scandal, was losing all moral authority. Rasputin's influence grew more brazen, his presence a constant insult to public decency and a symbol of the regime's corruption. Stolypin himself, the last capable statesman of the old order, was assassinated in 1911 in the presence of the Tsar. His successor was a nonentity. The ship of state was adrift, its captain preoccupied with family woes, its crew disillusioned, heading blindly toward the century's greatest storm. That storm broke in the summer of 1914. Bound by treaty to Serbia and by pan-Slavic sentiment, Russia was pulled into the Great War against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Initial patriotic unity saw the capital's German name, St. Petersburg, changed to the Slavic Petrograd. But the illusions of glory vaporized in the crucible of total war. The invasion of East Prussia ended in catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, where entire armies were lost due to staggering incompetence. A critical shortage of shells and rifles revealed an industrial base utterly inadequate for modern conflict. By 1915, the Great Retreat had cost millions of casualties and vast territories. In a fateful decision, Nicholas II left Petrograd in 1915 to assume personal command of the army at the front. Politically, it was a disaster. He was now directly responsible for every defeat. Meanwhile, the government in the capital fell into the hands of the Empress Alexandra and, through her, the disreputable Rasputin. As ministers were hired and fired based on the mystic's whims, the administration descended into paralytic chaos. On the home front, the economy collapsed. Inflation skyrocketed, food and fuel supplies broke down, and queues for bread lengthened in the freezing winter streets of Petrograd. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, the empire was a shell. The aristocracy itself had turned against the throne. Nobles murdered Rasputin in December in a desperate attempt to save the monarchy from itself. It was too late. In March 1917, February by the old Russian calendar, bread riots in Petrograd sparked spontaneous strikes. When the garrison troops, peasants in uniform, weary of war, refused to fire on the crowds and instead joined them, the revolution became inevitable. Within days, with his capital in rebel hands and his armies refusing to support him, Nicholas II abdicated. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended not with a bang, but with a few quiet strokes of a pen in a railway car. The autocracy was gone. Power fell to a shaky provisional government of liberal politicians and to the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies. This dual power was paralyzed from the start. The provisional government, led by figures like Alexander Kerensky, chose to continue the disastrous war, honoring commitments to the Allies. This was its fatal error. The war-weary masses wanted peace above all else. As the summer offensive of 1917 crumbled into more defeat and desertion, radical voices grew stronger. In April 1917, with German assistance, Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia from exile. His message was simple, brutal, and perfectly tuned to the national despair. Immediate peace, all land to the peasants, all power to the Soviets. Peace, land, bread was an irresistible slogan. The moderate socialists in charge, still dreaming of parliamentary democracy, were swept aside by the rising tide of revolutionary fury. In November 1917, October by the old calendar, the Bolsheviks, Lenin's disciplined radical faction, stormed the Winter Palace. The takeover was nearly bloodless. The old government had simply melted away. The provisional government had promised a future. The Bolsheviks promised tomorrow. And in the darkness of that war-torn winter, tomorrow was all a desperate people could hope for. But what kind of dawn would this radical new sun bring? The dawn the Bolsheviks brought was not one of gentle light, but of cleansing fire. Their first acts were declarations of a new world, a decree on peace, offering an immediate end to the war at any cost, and a decree on land, handing noble estates over to peasant communes. But the promise of peace came with the humiliation of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, surrendering Ukraine, the Baltic lands, and vast territories to Germany. The promise of land was soon contradicted by grain requisitions to feed the cities. The revolution, it turned out, demanded its own heavy price. Almost immediately, the new Red regime found itself fighting for its life in a brutal, multifaceted civil war. White armies formed in the south, east, and north, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, and socialists united only by their hatred of the Bolsheviks. Foreign powers, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, intervened with troops, hoping to strangle the radical experiment in its crib. In the countryside, green armies of peasants fought both sides, wanting only to be left alone. Russia plunged into a chaos more terrible than the World War, a savage conflict where ideology, nationalism, and sheer survival bled together. The Bolsheviks responded with war communism, the abolition of money, the nationalization of all industry, and the forcible seizure of grain from peasants. The result was economic collapse and famine. Yet, through a combination of revolutionary terror, the organizational genius of Leon Trotsky in building the Red Army, and the fatal disunity of their enemies, they prevailed. The white forces were defeated, the foreign armies withdrew. But victory came at a cost of millions of lives and the complete militarization of the revolutionary state. In 1921, even the regime's most loyal supporters rebelled. The sailors of the Kronstadt naval fortress, heroes of the 1917 revolution, rose up demanding the Soviets without Bolsheviks, true workers' democracy. The rebellion was drowned in blood by the Red Army. Its suppression marked the definitive end of any romantic, libertarian revolution. Lenin, pragmatically, then pivoted. He introduced the new economic policy, NEP, a tactical retreat that allowed small-scale private trade and farming. It was a compromise with capitalism to save socialism, and it brought fragile recovery. When Lenin died in 1924, the struggle for his succession began. It was a battle not just of men, but of ideas. Leon Trotsky advocated permanent revolution, arguing that socialism in Russia could only survive by spreading revolution abroad. His rival, the seemingly dull-party bureaucrat Joseph Stalin, promoted socialism in one country, the idea that Russia must first build its own fortress state, strong and isolated. Stalin won. By 1927, Trotsky was exiled, and Stalin's grip on the party apparatus was absolute. What followed was a second, even more violent revolution from above. The NEP was scrapped. Stalin launched the first five-year plan, a breakneck campaign of forced industrialization that turned agrarian Russia into a major industrial power in a decade, building steel mills, dams, and factories with the sweat and blood of millions. At the same time, he forced the collectivization of agriculture, destroying the independent peasantry. The resistance was met with deliberate famine, most horrifically in Ukraine, where millions perished. This was terror as an economic tool. The 1930s became the era of the Great Purge. Paranoid and ruthless, Stalin turned the machinery of the secret police against the Communist Party itself, against the military high command, against intellectuals, against anyone imagined as a threat. Show trials, forced confessions, and midnight arrests created a society paralyzed by fear. The old Bolsheviks, the heroes of 1917, were almost all executed. The revolution had begun to devour its children with a systematic horror that Tsars could scarcely have imagined. Then came an even greater test, the Nazi invasion in June 1941. The war, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, was a conflict of apocalyptic scale and brutality. The Soviet Union bore the overwhelming brunt of the Nazi war machine. After catastrophic initial defeats, the Red Army, hardened by terror and mobilized by a potent mix of patriotism and communist ideology, began its long, grinding counteroffensive. The battles of Stalingrad and Kursk became turning points in world history. The cost was staggering, over 20 million Soviet citizens dead, but in May 1945, the red flag flew over the smoldering ruins of Berlin. Victory in the war cemented the Soviet Union as one of two global superpowers, locked in a Cold War confrontation with the United States. It had a vast nuclear arsenal, a sphere of influence covering half of Europe, and a seemingly permanent seat at the table of world power. Stalin had taken the backward empire of the Tsars and forged it, through unimaginable suffering, into a modern industrial and military colossus. He died in 1953, leaving a system that was both monumentally powerful and profoundly distorted. In the decades that followed, the system slowly calcified. The utopian fire of the revolution guttered out, replaced by the gray bureaucracy of a stagnant police state. Yet the imperial contours remained. The Soviet Union was, in many ways, the Russian Empire reborn in a red cloak, A multinational entity ruled from the center, dominated by Russian culture, and defined by its rivalry with the West. The old dreams of Constantinople were gone, but the new dream of global communist revolution served a similar purpose, justifying limitless ambition and endless struggle. Could this new, ideological empire avoid the fate of the old one? Or were the same fatal flaws? The tension between central control and local aspiration, between stagnation and the need for change, merely waiting beneath the surface to re-emerge? The flaws did not wait quietly. They festered beneath the surface of parades and five-year plans. The Soviet Empire, for all its industrial might and military power, was built on a foundation of lies and inefficiency. Its economy, ossified by central planning, could produce nuclear missiles but not quality shoes or enough bread. Its ideology, once a source of fervent belief, had become a dead language of empty slogans, incapable of inspiring anyone under the age of 70. The vast prison camps of the Gulag remained, a silent testament to the state's enduring cruelty. This was not the radiant future the revolution had promised. It was a tired, paranoid gerontocracy presiding over a society of cues and whispers. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he recognized the system was dying of stagnation. His twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were a desperate attempt at CPR to inject truth and economic rationality to save the socialist state. But opening the window after 70 years of sealed silence created a hurricane. Long-suppressed truths about Stalin's terror, about economic failures, and about environmental catastrophes came flooding out, shattering whatever residual faith remained. The restructuring of the economy only highlighted its profound brokenness. More devastatingly, glasnost unleashed the national aspirations that the Tsarist and Soviet empires had both struggled to contain. In the Baltic republics, the Caucasus, and Ukraine, long-dormant independence movements roared to life. The Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, maintained by Soviet tanks, dissolved in 1989 as satellite states broke free. The empire was unraveling from its edges. The central authority in Moscow, stripped of both fear and legitimacy, found it had nothing left to hold the Union together. Not ideology, not force, not economic benefit. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a final, clumsy coup to turn back the clock, detaining Gorbachev. Their failure, heroically defied by crowds in Moscow led by Boris Yeltsin, was the death knell. The Communist Party was suspended. One by one, the Soviet republics declared their sovereignty. On December 25, 1991, the red flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceased to exist, dissolving into 15 independent nations. The empire, in its final incarnation, was gone. It ended not with a war or a revolution, but with a bureaucratic whimper and a signature on a document. So, what remains of the centuries-long saga that began in the wooden fort of Muscovy? The geography endures, the vast plains, the frozen north, the strategic rivers. So too does the psychological inheritance, a deep-seated suspicion of the West, a yearning for great power status, a culture that has produced both sublime beauty and profound suffering. The double-headed eagle has returned, replacing the Soviet crest on the Kremlin walls, a symbol of continuity across the revolutionary chasm. The central, haunting question that plagued every ruler from Ivan the Great to the last General Secretary: how to govern a territory of such immense scale and diversity, how to modernize without losing control, remains unanswered for the modern Russian state. The tension between autocratic tradition and the demands of a modern society, between imperial ambition and economic reality, between isolation and integration, continues to shape its path. The story of the Russian Empire is not merely a chronicle of tsars and treaties. It is a human story on an epic scale. It is the story of the peasant bound to the soil, the conscript freezing in a trench, the idealist dreaming of a better world in a St. Petersburg garret, the family trembling at a midnight knock on the door. It is a story of astonishing resilience and catastrophic folly, of spiritual yearning and brutal realpolitik. It teaches us that no structure, however mighty it seems, is permanent. Walls of ice and walls of ideology both eventually melt. It reminds us that the pursuit of empire often consumes the pursuer, that the instruments of control, whether the service state, the secret police, or the party apparatus, can turn against their creators. But it also shows the enduring power of culture, of faith, and of the human spirit to create beauty and seek meaning, even under the heaviest of yokes. As you drift towards sleep, let the echoes of this immense history fade into the quiet of the night. The bells of Novgorod are silent, the cannons at Sevastopol are cold, the debates in the Smolny Institute are over. All that remains is the quiet turning of the page and the peaceful darkness. Thank you for letting Sleepy Owl guide you through this epic journey. If these stories of the past help you find rest in the present, we would be so grateful if you'd subscribe. Share this tale with someone who loves history. And remember, the greatest empire you'll ever build is the one of peaceful dreams. Good night.